Welcome to the final stretch of our kickoff day number 1. Next, we have in store for you our keynote speaker of the day. She has more than 50 years of experience in tourism as an independent consultant, strategist, international speaker, change agent, and she's now an acclaimed thought leader in the emerging field of regenerative tourism. Her practices not only aim to preserve, but actively contribute to the restoration and enhancement of local cultures, economies, and environments. Anna Pollock's vast contribution to the field of regenerative tourism extends beyond theory. Her work rethinks the traditional tourism model, embracing a more holistic and regenerative approach. Her speech today is bound to enlighten, challenge, and inspire us as we navigate through the complexities of sustainability in the context of our Arctic communities. So, without further ado, please join me in welcoming the sought-after speaker, Anna Pollock.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. And first of all, obviously, thank you very much for inviting me back to this beautiful part of the world. I'm usually as a keynote first on, so at the end of the day, you'll probably notice that the nerves start building. But you seem like a really friendly bunch, and I'm really inspired by the presentations I've heard already. So without ado, I'll get going. I did notice on the program, however, that you've got me down as speaking how to prepare for a polycrisis. I wasn't aware of that title, but it matches very well with the one I chose to use, which is, it's time to change our minds. And I want to start by doing a little bit of reminiscing. I mean, that's what happens when you've been in the business for 50 years. Thinking, where did it all start and how did I end up talking about the stuff I'm going to share with you today? And the seeds were sown way back in the 1970s when I had a chance to meet this man, Willis Harman. He became not only very senior within the Stanford Research Institute in California, but he went on with Edgar Mitchell, one of the early astronauts, to form the Institute of Noetic Sciences, which is now a very well-established institute for really pushing the, if you like, the boundaries of our understanding. And he was in Vancouver, which is where I started my career in tourism, and looking to form the World Business Academy, which is still existing now, because he believed that it was business that was going to be the entity that would end up helping us make the changes that we need to make and that I'll be talking about today. But my title really comes from the list of this section from his amazing book called The Global Mind Change. He was one of the first, not first, but one of several people in the 70s on the west coast of North America that were really looking at our need to change the paradigm, to change the thinking. And that, I suppose, has been a theme of all my work, even though I've spent quite a lot of that time doing conventional tourism work. But for the first half of my presentation, you'll wonder if you're in the right place at all, because I'm going to be taking you out of yourselves, out of this preoccupation with what's immediately tourism, to what's behind it, but what's behind the changes that we need to make. But he noticed, and I believe this passionately, that really the most fundamental changes happen in history, in society, when a vast number of people change their minds, even if it's just a little bit. And I'd like to think after these 2 days together, you will go home with a slight change in your mind about what's becoming very important to you. And so it's a relevant title. I'm going to make 5 key points throughout this presentation. And what I like to do is start with them. Because, you know, it's the end of the day. Some of you might be wanting to have a nap. But if you can remember the 5 points, you don't need all the detail, but it's important. So I'll go through those quite quickly. But the first one is that we have used up all the time that's left to make incremental little modifications. So all of us together can do those little changes, but together they have to become something fairly big and ultimately change the very system that underpins the way that we have traditionally done tourism. What we're seeing right now is a lot of talk about the failure of various systems. You may be aware that there's acknowledgement the food system is collapsing. The healthcare system is collapsing. Some people think even the educational system is collapsing. But when do you hear about anyone talking about the tourism system collapsing? Do we even see what we do as part of a system? And that's what I'm going to try and take you through today. The second point is that the issue isn't recovery. There is no going back to business as usual. And I'm not going to labour that point, but we have to agree on one thing. We are being forced by the circumstances that we're living in right now, regardless of how we got there, to be doing things differently in the future. I see COVID very much as nature providing a pause, a warning, that we are far more vulnerable than we would like to think we are. We have all this technology, we think we can overcome it with a fix here and a fix there, and if we throw enough money at it, we'll get through it. That isn't necessarily the case. We do have to re-examine with a great deal of honesty what brought us to this point. So the change will only occur if we do in fact look at the fundamental assumptions that we've been carrying around in our heads as to how the world really works. All of us are, if you like, someone said, like egos on stalks, but those egos have been trained or brainwashed by society. Brainwash is maybe too harsh a term, but we've all absorbed as we're growing up certain principles about how you get ahead, how you treat each other, what's out there, how we understand how the world works. Now, the long name for that is called a paradigm or a pattern of thinking. And we are carrying around, in a sense, the result of nearly 200-300 years of thinking, but it's only 200 or 300 years. What was it Leonard said? People have lived here for several thousands of years. There are all kinds of ways of thinking that precede the one that we are carrying around in our heads right now. So we've got to have that degree of flexibility, first of all, to see it. So it was David Bohm, who's one of the most amazing scientists of our time, who said the ability to think differently is more important than the knowledge, all the facts, all the theories, etc., that you may carry around. But to be able to see why you're thinking the way you're thinking and how you're thinking the way you're thinking. What we're seeing right now, the problems that we've got, are emanating from the fact that our current system is based on certain assumptions that are flawed. They're just not correct. For hundreds of years, we thought we could control our reality. We thought it was made up of separate things that we could manipulate and control. For example, the environment, the wilderness. We see them as objects out there that we can visit, we can interact with, we can change, we can control, we can manipulate. Climate change, it's another thing. That's the way we think. We think objects are separate, that I'm a separate person from you. Every one of you is sitting in a community and we're all utterly interconnected. It was David Bohm, a physicist, a quantum physicist, who showed that everything around us is utterly entangled. And what that means is every one of us matters. You can't say, I'm too small, this is the person I get on with my job, it doesn't matter. Every one of us matters. Every thought we have matters. Every word we speak matters. what I'm doing right now matters. And we've been trained to think, however, that we're separate, we don't count, and therefore we can just walk by oblivious to what's going on. Point 4. Once you realize that, and that everything is connected, and there are other things I'll come over in a minute, when you change the way you understand how the world actually works, then your purpose in life will change. You will rechange how you define success. All right? So everything is interrelated, one follows from the other. And the 5th point really, and this is the exciting thing, is that I think that the domain that we're in, I don't like calling it an industry, and I'll explain why. We are in a community, a domain of activity that has the label tourism and hospitality. But when you get down to its essence and what we do, it suggests that we have a very distinct role and responsibility to play in helping us make this change of thinking that I've been talking about. So, what sort of change is being called for? Well, normally change, I think you're all aware, change is a constant. Life is changing every day. I'll be a changed person as a result of being here. It happens. It's part of life. But the kind of change that most people are talking about is changing the way we do things. It's a shift in behavior. People are beginning to use the word transformation, and again, the problem with words, and I think it was Leonard that was talking about this as well, that if you use a word often enough, it loses its meaning, and it often loses its strength. The word transformation is a very, very powerful word. It's about what goes on the inside. You change your wardrobe. You say, oh, she's a transformed, person. That's not the case. Still a person wearing a different set of clothes. Change of behavior maybe, but the change is not that deep. The kind of change we're talking about it's so deep, as I say, it affects our purpose, our sense of values. It affects everything. The key thing about transformation is that when you have experienced that, you can't go back to being the person you were before. The best example, of course, is the caterpillar that is chomping away on the ground, or chomping away on the leaves and eating everything as fast as it can, and then goes to sleep, hangs up in its cocoon, and miraculously transforms into a butterfly. It can fly. It was on its belly crawling along before. That's a transformation. And that's the kind of change that we actually are being asked to make. It's an evolutionary stage that we are at. So just in case you thought it wasn't very important, you can't get bigger than that kind of change, okay? Excuse me. All right, here's an example. Would you, hands up, if you would agree with this statement, or this? Be bold, it's okay, no one's counting, no one's looking. Well, I noticed that most of you, in fact, did agree with that statement. It's interesting, isn't it? We say one sick planet. We don't say one broken planet. That's because at the deepest level in every one of us, we know that the planet is alive. And that's again where science is actually now showing us that planet Earth is a living system. They use the Greek name Gaia maybe as to help us understand it. But living Earth, is constantly adjusting. We've been adjusting to the fact that the distance between us and the sun has been increasing over time, but we've managed to maintain a fairly constant relationship and a constant temperature. She's adjusting all the time, so she is living. But when you look at our culture, when you look at our science, when you look at all the premises underneath everything we think, we see it as a machine. We talk about everything being separate and being things and acting in a machine-like manner. So bear that in mind, because that's the biggest shift, is when we become consciously aware that we are alive beings, utterly interconnected, integral parts of a living system, you're going to behave a lot differently than if you just think it's a piece of furniture we're occupying or sitting on or something like that. And this planet is our home. This planet provides us with everything we need as individuals to be alive, all right? I came across an interesting study from the, I think it was the World Travel and Tourism Council talking about nature tourism. And they actually had a sentence right at the beginning saying 80% of tourism is dependent on nature. Well, how did the other 20% manage? See what I'm getting at? You know, we think we can carve things up. I'll explain that more in a minute. But right now, you've got your very famous Stockholm Resilience Centre, which has done absolutely stunning work in terms of environmental science, is showing us that Gaia, Mother Earth, the planet, has limits. There's only so much waste she can absorb. There's only so much impact that we can have on her before things start to break down. And they've identified, as you probably are aware, I'd like to think you should be very proud of this institute, that you have 9 planetary boundaries of activity. The inner green circle suggests that that's the edge of them. Beyond that, things are going to start to break down quite quickly. And unfortunately, 6 of those 9 boundaries have already been transgressed. In other words, we're in trouble. I'm not going to dwell on the negative today. I think we have to face reality, and this is part of it. So we're out of sync with the natural world. We think that we can keep on growing and expanding and doing what we've always done, but nature doesn't work that way. Nature never stands still, but there are no straight lines in nature. And not only that, but this pattern is repeated over and over again. I'm a perfect example of that pattern. I'm up there at the top of the mature. That's what happens after 75 years of being on the planet. I know that I can't go on forever. No living thing can go on forever. One of the problems we have with cancer is it's a rogue cell. There are things that can go on forever. And that's why we have to do our best to either kill the cell before the cell kills the host and then ends its life. So it's pretty serious getting that idea into your head. But if you talk to most economists on very aggressive business people, there's no end to where we can go. Now, what's happening is growth then gets defined differently. It's not so much in quantity and impact. We can start to look at growth in terms of quality, in terms of development. And that, again, is what happens. Not only, I'd like to think, I certainly haven't got much bigger since about when the circle there grew. I've been about 5 foot for a long, long time now. But I'd also like to think that I'm getting a little smarter. You might disagree with this at the end of the presentation, but I am learning a lot. And I think we were talking about the wisdom that comes with a bit of age in another conversation. So this isn't change. This is the UNWTO right now saying, oh well, COVID was, aren't we clever, we got over COVID, we're back, we can go on doing what we've always done, we can keep growing. I don't believe that's possible. And I'm really, really, really disappointed that the leadership in tourism generally is not spending time saying, how can we do things differently? They all had nice words to talk about reset and, during the COVID, but it seems to have been somewhat forgotten. This is what I call, excuse me, I must have a drink. This is what I call cognitive dissonance, when you have 2 conflicting ideas on either side of your brain that you're carrying around. The graph on the left shows obviously how tourism just steadily grew, so consistently we thought we were invincible. And then of course 2019 came and we wiped out nearly 20, 30 years of growth overnight, as it were, and it was a big shock. The graph on the right, look at the similarity of the pattern. It is the same growth up, but the green going down is what we have to reduce in terms of our impact in terms of emission, which is only a piece of the puzzle, by the way. but we have to reduce that by half. I think most of you are all aware of that. Between now and 2030, we're supposed to cut back our activity by a half. At the same time, the WTTC is saying the global travel and tourism sectors are projected to return to pre-pandemic levels and grow at an average growth rate of 5.8% per year between 2022 and 2032. What that actually means is tourism is going to double in size, and if you use that measure of success, and I'm going to show you that is not the measure that we can use for success, that means twice as many people traveling on the planet and all the infrastructure associated with accommodating that movement between now and the year 2034, which is almost exactly the time we're supposed to halve it from where it is right now. So my criticism is not so much just we can't grow, because I am going to suggest there are places where growth is necessary and where it's justified. But I am suggesting we have to use our brains to think about some of the things we're saying and question them. Question them whether they're possible, and question them whether they're even appropriate. Travel Foundation, another one. This is a report everyone should read. Again, it's showing the demand projections. In this case, it's the green going up, and the red is what we need to cut. So the delta between those two is whopping. Okay, this is what we need to be dealing with at the present time. So we're looking at the moment now from one crisis to another. Nature's doing its best to show that there are limits, actually. So we had COVID, we had all of the talk about climate change and emissions, and then the sort of emphasis shifted because people realized, oh my God, there's no insects on the windshield of my car anymore. The biodiversity, the huge complexity of nature is also beginning to disappear. Climate change, again, I just wanted to, I'm not going to dwell on the negative, but if you can't bear this in mind and think about how we're going to get through this, then I'm feeling that we're walking into into an abyss, really. I love this headline. This is the latest. I don't know whether people are getting their jollies out of these headlines, but gobsmackingly bananas was the headline in The Guardian the other day when the September figures came out. I just have to say, what is it going to take? Do you understand this graph? It's the average temperature in September for years and years and years and years until you get to 2020, and that's when the red ones start off. So it's a problem. So why do we have to change in tourism? Well, obviously, we're not separate from the rest of society. We are a living system. Tourism is a living system. Your family is a living system. You are a living system. And they're all nested within other living systems. And as I said at the beginning, the biggest living system of all is not very well at the moment. We're going from one polycrisis to another. This was the World Trade Organization talked about a polycrisis. This is the World Economic Forum. They used to put their crises into boxes. If you ever read their stuff, every year they'd have a series of crises. The crises would differ a little bit, but they put them in boxes. Then they got ecological on us and decided they'd use circles and present it differently. But nevertheless, they're also talking about a polycrisis. And Antonio Guterres, whom I do admire, because he's got to be one of the most honest and worried leaders on the planet, he speaks it the way it is, says now we have to change course. We cannot continue to measure our success by something called the GDP, and we need to shift to a circular and regenerative economy. They're also identifying that the Sustainable Development Goals, which again were a step in the right direction, except the problem with them is they cut them into 17 separate goals, not realizing every one of them was related to everyone else. But regardless of that criticism, they haven't been successful. We're halfway through the time, and most of them have the dial has barely moved at all, and 30% and only 40% have seen a little bit of improvement. So, as I say, I don't want to give you because I'm very positive actually about the future, provided that every one of us in this room is prepared to go home thinking differently. So that's your homework. Okay, so where are we now? This is probably the most telling situation. We are literally, and you know, it's exciting. It's the most exciting period in human history because we are a population that are aware that we're going through these changes. And we're having to go through these changes in a very, very compressed period of time. All right, so that's the unfortunate thing. You can't go through this without saying, I just didn't know. A few hundred years ago, when Copernicus discovered that the sun wasn't going around us, we were going around the sun. If you remember that from history lessons, no one really noticed how important that observation was going to be. It was the beginning of the scientific revolution, and people like Galileo and everyone else that came after that formed the basis of our science. That took over several hundred years. We're being asked to completely make the same level of change in a matter of maybe 50 years, at tops, maybe less than that. So what we're seeing at the moment is the decay or dying of a dominant system and the emergence of another one. And many of you, by thinking differently and trying different things, are part of this emerging system. In fact, based on the conversations I've heard, I would suggest that you are mostly aware. It's just putting together all the different pieces. So the biggest challenge right now is that we've been trying to make changes on the surface. We haven't been going to the root cause of them. And the root cause, what's going on down here, is the way we think. And we know this because Einstein was a pretty smart dude, and he said this himself. Many of you may quote him. Certainly a lot of people like me quote him a lot. He said that we cannot change the world unless we change the way we see it. It's the crisis in perception. So what is that crisis? And that crisis was explained by another very amazing guy called Gregory Bates, an ecologist in the 1940s. And he put it this way. He said, until we start to think the way nature thinks, and you'll begin to see where I'm going with this, then again, we're not going to make the changes that we need to make. So I've been asked to talk about regeneration, and this is where regeneration fits. Because if you look at this graph, basically, does it have a life of its own? Just a minute. I didn't touch it, I think. Stay there. All right, on the left. And I do appreciate your patience because I'm ramming through an awful lot of stuff in 45 minutes. But essentially where we were on the left side of the curve after the Industrial Revolution, we were busy making stuff and selling stuff and moving stuff and creating a heck of a lot of waste and burning up a lot of energy. We began to realize, and Rachel Carson can take a lot of credit for this, oops, maybe we're doing some harm at the same time. And we saw the birth of the sustainability movement in the 1980s. So then, as time has gone by, we're all busy doing sustainability. What's the next thing? Well, obviously, if possible, you try and do no harm. And we're just beginning to move into that space. I mean, that's a pretty tall order. Now we've got people saying, but maybe we can actually make good the damage we've done. And you've probably heard that people are talking about net positive. Does that sound familiar? I'm working with the Sustainable Hospitality Alliance, the top brands in hotels, and they've now decided that net positive sounds so much more positive than sustainability. That's what they're talking about. But that's about putting something back. And a lot of people say, well, that's what regeneration is. It's leaving a place better than you found it. But it's not. Because if it doesn't involve that change of thinking, that change of relationship with the rest of the world, if you're still doing it the same old way, trying to do less harm, put something back, you're stuck. And there's a big reason that there's a big gap between the sustainability world, which we have to do, by the way, we have to do those things, and the regenerative world, which is we change our minds, we change our relationship with nature, we work with nature, we cooperate with her, we realize we are nature, and we then go on, ideally, to start to live on the planet very differently. So the fourth steps of doing that is, first of all, understanding what the hell I'm talking about. And I know I can't do any more than simply describe this passage very quickly to you today. And if you are interested, I'm more than happy to work with the cluster to provide more information. So if you want to learn more about this, then that's possible. But it involves this change of relationship with nature, with each other, with ourselves. And this guy here is an Australian, has done a very good TED talk which explains why and how this change has taken place over time. And it's the scientists that are telling us that we have to change. And again, I can't go into this in the time that we have today, but I can leave, you'll have all these slides and you'll have the recording if it's worth having to get you thinking. You know, you can go back and say, well, who are these scientists and why should I be interested in them? But the point is, the ground is shifting beneath our feet. We talked about this shift from just looking at climate to looking at biodiversity and the change there. This is a major study from a new intergovernmental science policy platform on biodiversity and ecosystem services. Can you imagine that people actually work in organizations with names like that, but they do? And I'm all part of them because they're doing great work. But what was really interesting, because they're the ones that really look at our policy towards development. And this is, to me, when it gets quite interesting, because they sort of had a eureka moment when they realized that not everybody looks at the natural world the way we do. There are other worldviews on the planet Earth. And if you think about it, it's the European, North American, Australia, New Zealand, that basically the colonial nations of the past that dominate the scientific thinking and also dominate the economy of the world. And we're all in that frame of mind that says nature's a resource. It's there for us to extract from. It's there for us to make something of and sell and grow and so on and so on. But there are an awful lot of people out there in nature who in the world rather, who see it very differently. And they point out that some say, okay, they look at living from nature, that's our dominant way of looking at it, to living with it, and then the indigenous world that say living as nature. And that's why, and I'm going to make this point several times over, the indigenous perspective has suddenly become so valuable to people who realize, how do you live as nature? How do you think as nature thinks? And it's the indigenous people of the planet who've been living harmoniously with nature, as nature, for thousands of years. And as Leonard said, 6% of the landmass and 80% of the biodiversity. Now that says to me they're pretty successful at this, and we have something to learn. So there are a number of indigenous teachers, and I mention it because what I'm excited about in this part of the globe, not just your bit of it, but also Greenland, northern Canada and so on, is a very strong indigenous population right in your midst, with the knowledge that can help us learn what living as nature really means. Because the shift is to, as I said, understand that we are nature, we're integral parts of her. And it's because of these shifts that are taking place right now and that fundamental recognition that we cannot grow in quantity forever, that you're seeing this more and more now, this thought, well, maybe we can't continue to grow. In other words, a public recognition of something that many people have been worried about for quite some time. It started in the 70s with Limits to Growth. That was a very famous book that came out when I was my first year at university. Obviously, it had an impact on me. Then it picked up again in the 90s with other books. There's now this talk about degrowth, post-growth, beyond growth, and then finally this to reference back to what Leonard was saying, decoupling debunked, because the idea of green growth, forget it. all the scientific evidence says we cannot continue to grow in terms of our quantity of materials we use, the stuff we produce, the waste we produce. We can't do that and make it green, no matter how hard we try. So maybe we have to, in the Western world, not all of the world and not all parts of the Western world, we're going to have to slow down our rate of material throughput if we're going to have a hope of getting through the next few years. So this is partly where regeneration fits, because regeneration is saying, right, how can we change the way we define growth so that we see it as nature sees it? It's not getting bigger, it's growing in maturity, in complexity, in beauty, and in order. How do we take a sick planet and revitalize it? Regeneration is really revitalization. How do we breathe life back into something that actually is in decay? But the best example I have of this, when you look at purpose, I don't think you have oak trees, but you have birches and you have spruces. And it was Annika the other day that was saying on the way to the restaurant, look at these beautiful birches. They've reached maturity, right? They don't get any taller than that. Well, it's the same with an oak tree. My office at home sits, I look at a beautiful oak tree. It's 400 years old. It stopped growing probably 100 years ago. But what it has grown in is incredible complexity. That tree now is home to maybe 200 to 300 different species of living animals, fungus as well, lichens, insects, birds, you name it, live in that oak tree. It provides a home for that. Now I throw out this point to you. Supposing you're a community, but you are in communities, do you grow your tourism business just in terms of the number of visitors that come, or the number of local businesses that might be supported by the number of businesses who come? Essentially what we're moving is from, as I said before, from quantity to quality to complexity. That is exactly how nature works. And we've got to start to put our brains together to say, if you take an area such as this, how can we have maybe just a few more visitors, because there might be enough space, there might be good reasons to increase it a little more, but how do we focus on visitors that spend a longer time here, spend more money here, but more importantly, want to buy things that can be produced by the people who live here, so that new opportunities develop for the residents of this particular region. I don't have all the answers, but I'm saying it's a different orientation that we have to bear in mind. So I said there were 4 steps. The third one is essentially, again, it comes back to this fact that all of this work that I'm talking about, and I'm just doing it in headlines, has to be done in a particular place. In other words, you have this global awareness of the need to shift, but then you make it manifest, you make it work for you in your particular region. And it could be that if you're in Finland, you do it slightly different than you would in Sweden. That's great, because every place is different. You think ecology, you think, how does this ecosystem work? Every single place on Earth is different. And again, part of this growth is in the growth of diversity, because with diversity you get stability. And you can then, when you do it in place where people live and where they're rooted and they have a sense of love, that's the other thing I've really enjoyed just the last couple of days. People have just stopped and looked out the window and said, oh, I just love this time of the evening when the light shines this way at this particular time of the year. I've heard that from several of you, and there is this real sense of pride and connection with this particular piece of geography, which is very, very different from the piece of geography that I live in. So again, you've got this mix of activities going on. You've got a mine over there. You don't have to see them as you're competing with them. You've got other activities. You've got forestry. I think Leonard was making reference to that. How do we come together in the Arctic and say, how can we coexist in a way that generates so much more value? Because that's what regeneration is about. It's generating value in the form of complexity, of beauty, of diversity. Knock some sense into me. This is what it's really all about. So I just throw that up because It's only when you sit down together, tourism is always in silos. You're all tourism people. I don't suppose there's any mining people, any forestry people in the audience. That's not how we've done it. We've stayed within our little bunkers, and we've seen that we have to compete for attention. The future will be when you're all sitting around and say, how do we make this beautiful city of Kiruna and these neighboring areas into something that is so much more generative in so many different ways, not just materially generative, not just financially, but in terms of culture, in terms of health, and so on, where everyone, the young kids, the teenagers, the elderly are as involved as people like you and I that are here today. There are great examples of this happening now. This is just 3. I can pull more together, where people are coming together in mixed, true communities in places, where they're taking responsibility for saying, what is it I love about this place? What am I worried about it? What do I want to leave my children? They're getting diverse perspectives around the table. And all the evidence is, when you get a bunch of ordinary people, maybe with a bit of expertise available if they need technical questions, but you get ordinary people talking about their place, what they want for it, what they think could happen, what they want to happen. It's amazing the amount of energy that's released and the amount of ideas that come up to the fore. And we in tourism have got to step into that community, into our communities, and start to play a facilitative role. Not just a marketing role, but a facilitative role. So this one on the left is where we started off in Flanders a few years ago, and that led to a number of small village regions in rural areas in Flanders doing their own work and linking up, because leader projects, you probably know European projects, you have to have more than one country. So this community in Flanders got together with Angus in Scotland and another community in Romania and worked together for 3 years. Each of them doing it in their own specific way, but helping one another. It's a great report. I'll let you have it if you're interested in. A colleague of mine, Diane, has been working in Tasmania with an island called Flinders Island. Again, the same thing. And if you want a national example of, I think, it's just an understanding of what makes a place, and it came up this morning, it is the people. Read the new strategy come out of the Faroe Islands. It's called Heim, saying that this place is first and foremost the home for the Faroe Islanders, and our job is to essentially facilitate them growing and becoming and flourishing. So the reason I think that tourism and hospitality is the group that could play this regenerative, generative type of role is because we're already in that business. What does hospitality mean? Where does the root of that word come from? It means to care. All right, we're essentially in the caring business. I've learned that in a very practical way because in the last few years I've opened my house up as a B&B. And I experienced this as Leonard would experience. I know with your guests, and I'm sure I'll see some smiling faces around here. You get a sort of very irritable person to come out of town on a Friday night to your place. Or they've saved up their money and they're coming for an expedition or whatever. But they're often bringing a lot of that tension and that, irritability with them. And then by the time they leave, thanks to your hospitality, they go home regenerated, revitalized, different. And to me, that's why we've got to come back to the essence of what it means to be in hospitality. Tourism is actually quite an artificial word to describe an industrial system of moving people to the point of consumption and then taking them back home again. But hospitality goes back hundreds, not necessarily thousands of years, but hundreds of years. I would argue it would go back thousands of years. There would have been a natural rule of hospitality amongst the Sami 7,000 years ago here, because if somebody had managed to travel for whatever reason or had gotten lost, they would have been welcomed and been made very safe and accommodated by the people in that community. Hospitality is one of the oldest acts of generosity that we do as human beings. So why not, why don't we see that as, if you like, our role and purpose going forward, so that we can actually help people understand the community they're in, what the beauty is around. That's why I asked Leonard that question, so that people see what they're actually looking at, really begin to feel it and taste it. You're in the position to be able to do those things. You're also in the position of connecting. One of the problems I stated at the beginning with our mindset, our way of thinking, is we see everyone as separate. Tourism is separate from mining. I'm separate from you. It's just a natural way we think, but we now know that's not the case. What we do in hospitality, and tourism is part of that as well, is we connect people who thought they were separate, who thought they were different. So when someone comes to see Leonard and have that experience that they couldn't even imagine sitting back in downtown Stockholm, and they go back changed, that is a connection which transforms. And that is what we're talking about here. That, to me, is where the true magic of being in hospitality is all about. I've managed to whiz through that in 44.5 seconds, minutes actually, so I'm going to end with a quote. You'll have all these slides if any of it hopefully means something to you. But I just think that Wangari Maathai, who did so much incredible work in Africa with tree planting and changing the way many women in Africa saw themselves, or in her part of the continent, we're really having a shift to a different level of consciousness. And if that sounds too airy-fairy for some of you, that's fine. But for many of you, I hope we've touched a bit of a chord and got you thinking. So on that note, I'm going to end dead on time. But thank you very much for your attention.
Let's have a look at the audience, who is very, very regenerated, maybe, of this.
Oh, I hope so.
Let's look. Do you have some questions, comments, something to share?
We usually talk about the 80-20 rule, that we have to focus on something. And I was thinking, what in the tourist business today are the most destroying? Is it the travels, or is it something else? Do we have some clue of what the thing we have to focus on first to make a big change?
Well, I think at the moment the biggest challenge is the carbon emissions. Let's face it, because we haven't got much time to get that down. But just to assume that if you just suddenly go carbon free, that's not going to solve the problem. But in terms of the 80% right now of impact, I would still say we have to do that. If we can do that, as I say, in a different way, which is not pointing the finger and saying, well, it's all the airline's fault, or it's all this fault, or whatever, that's not being helpful at the moment. Some places like this are going to be reliant upon people flying in. I just spent the month of August in the Pacific. These are very vulnerable societies, really experiencing climate change in a very unpleasant way, like 3 Cat 5 cyclones through your village in a year. You just build it back up and it's blown over, rising sea level and so on. The point being that they have their only source of foreign exchange is tourism. Interestingly, I'll just tell you the story there because it shows you nothing is simple. For the last 10, 15 years, they were encouraged to diversify from subsistence farming into tourism with foreign investment. That was the World Bank speaking. Well, that made a lot of sense to the World Bank and to the investors that were buying very cheap land to put up hotels. But of course, they built a nice tourism industry, but most of the money went in and then it went out. And when COVID hit, they all said, shut down, bye-bye, no work. And these people had gone into the communities to work in tourism, and they didn't have a plan B. But the elders, and there's still very much an indigenous culture, said, okay, plan B, go home, learn how to fish, learn how to grow, get back to your culture, learn your ways. Tourism will come back, but not the same way. And so what they've done there is they've building back their knowledge. They're also exploring different ways of presenting their own food. And now they've got visitors coming back who are different. These are visitors who are going to those islands because they want to experience the culture and the food. And the good news is they're ready for them. But they had to go back to being who they were for that to happen. So again, we can't just say no travel, no international travel. That wouldn't be fair. You wouldn't survive if I couldn't fly here. I haven't got, the means to drive here. But we have to get things in balance. And it's about telling the truth about what's really happening and just not shying away from it. Because that's what I'm seeing more than anything, is people just don't want to talk about this. I'm making you feel uncomfortable, I can sense that. And I'm not going to make an apology, because I'm doing you a favor.
Hi. Thank you. It's a very important message you're sharing with us. And I don't know if it's a question or maybe more comments, but I'm a bit worried that the message you're having might not directly or make people feel uncomfortable, but maybe in the way a lot of people presenting, like we're hurting the planet and the planet has feelings. Maybe they don't take that too seriously. Maybe they think, well, I pay taxes for somebody else to worry about that. But if you told people, don't you want a future for your children, that might stop people dead in their tracks.
Well, I agree, but I pay taxes in the UK. And my government right now is ranking up oil, the opening up of oil fields and making some crazy decisions. I can't rely on the government. It's not just me who's saying it. What we have to say is, look, we're all involved in this. You can't delegate survival to someone else. It's just that simple. And I agree, I didn't actually say the Earth had feelings, but the Earth reacts. All right, there are certain rules about how nature works. But I do believe that, this old idea of, well, leave it to us, because we know better. But what's actually happening now is what the people who know better are being paid by the people who've already got the money to do what they want to do. And the system is getting very polarized, but it's also getting, what's the best word I can say? I think it's co-opted in a way. So they're not going to, it's like the folks in the Pacific, no one is rushing to help them now. They're having to do it themselves. And ultimately that will be true for every single one of us. We have to take responsibility. And again, if you want to look at how nature does it, every single element of nature, from the cell through to the organ, is self-organizing. It's responding to the system of which it is a part. And it has a vested interest in that system of which it is a part being healthy. So it works towards that end. My liver is taking account of the lovely meal I had last night and the extra wine I shouldn't have drunk. All right? I'm using that rather crudely, but, later laugh. The point is, that's what we need to do as human beings and as communities and as societies. It's taking back that responsibility for dealing with something and not leaving it to somebody. What's happening then is your power is being skyjacked by somebody else. So regeneration ultimately is about people, it's about empowerment, whereas the current system is systematically disempowering, I think.
Right, we have another question or comment here.
Jussi Raittinen from Arctic Snow Hotel. I used to be a teacher of tourism for 18 years. And in the same time, I had the privilege of teaching sustainable development for 18 years. So it was like I'm teaching this, and then I know this. So I told to the students all the way that I'm actually trying to provide more tourism in the Arctic region, but the other hand, I know that we are destroying the Arctic region at the same time. So I felt torn apart for 18 years. And then I had a discussion with the Finnair pilot a couple of years ago, and he said that when he started out, he thought that this is the best job in the world, and now he thinks that he's in a world-destroying business because he burns fuel flying from Helsinki to New York, it's about 80 or 85,000 liters of gasoline. So I totally agree with you, but I don't know what else to do. I don't have any other profession, but this is something that I think a lot, and I really, really enjoyed your presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm not here to make you feel guilty any more than I feel guilty. There's no point. Guilt doesn't achieve anything. It doesn't achieve anything. But honesty and facing something, you know, if like you're in the desert and you see that sand, mountain of sand coming in your direction, and you turn back and pretend it might go the other way, that's not very sensible. So in our case, all I'm saying is that each of us can do a little piece. It said, change your minds just a little bit. It's the aggregate. We're all in different compromising positions. I suppose, you know, I'm standing here. I was invited to work on this agritourism project in Vanuatu in Ireland. I'm sure none of you have heard of. Be happy to introduce you to it. And of course that meant I flew from here to Brisbane and Brisbane to Vanuatu to Fiji and back home. I hate to think how much carbon is associated with that flight. Should I have done it? But that's the business I'm in. That's the only means I have at the moment of making a living. And many people are in that situation. Pointing the finger and making people feel ashamed is not helping. What is helping is grown-up conversations and saying, well, we're all in it together, how can we do our bit? So all I'm asking you to do is realize that you do make a difference. You can, no matter how small it might be, don't give up, because we all can get through this. I honestly believe that, or I wouldn't be standing here. But there are certain areas where we have to make some big strategic choices, like maybe really put greater emphasis on turning on the people in the south of the country that know so little about the north of the region, because I've heard that today. How do we get people sitting in Stockholm and Copenhagen and even in London aware that this is a fascinating place to come to, as opposed to flitting off on a cheap cruise or a cheap whatever? That's probably not a good comparison, but you know what I'm saying. I wish I had lots of answers. All I'm trying to do is get people to realize that there is a different way.
I come from Hariniva Hotels and Safaris. We're a small family-owned company on the Finnish-Swedish border in Muonio. And while we're speaking, there are many operators building new beds to Lapland as we speak, and kind of trying to cash in on the winter and the money that it brings to us. And lots of talk about Northern Lights and snowy this and snowy that. And I think there is a way to change. I mean, the whole society is changing. I mean, maybe one day people travel for a much, much longer period of time. Maybe they come to Arctic Europe and they spend maybe 1 month, 2 months here, and don't, instead of traveling to Mediterranean 5 times a year or flying to New York and then next month to Asia or whatnot. So I think there is an opportunity and a chance that we're gonna have to take it and just, you know, start being imaginative and thinking how different travel chains can be created. Well, how do we get people to move around in the area so that it's both flexible and doable and not so consuming, so to say?
Yeah, I think, I mean, you said a lot of people are rushing to take advantage of this new interest in the winter. I mean, I've seen that in many places where you get a lot of copycat development. And that's where I think is you come together as a community and look at, you know, your bed capacity, what's involved in terms of who's coming, how many, you know, together decide. Because in some communities, that decision's not made by you. So, I mean, I worked for the island of country of Samoa. They thought, again, they were told, you've got to grow tourism, grow tourism. The Prime Minister said, we've got to have more hotels, more hotels. All it did was really make it very difficult for the existing hoteliers to survive any kind of downturn in business, because they ended up with far more capacity than could weather bad times as well as good times. So if you look at it as a living system, you've got a certain amount of capacity there. You can grow the number of beds, when there's a growing number of people. But then you ask the question, well, who's going to benefit from that? In these countries that I've been working in, it's Chinese investors. No disrespect to the Chinese, but they come in with their money, build property, and the money then when it's run by Chinese tour operators, and so that they weren't thinking about who benefited from that. The numbers look good. You know, they had for a while, they had increasing visitors, but then when COVID hit, and I'm saying COVID is not an exception, it may not be, God forbid we have another one, but it's quite possible, or there could be something else, or they have 2 or 3 Cat 5, you know, hurricanes go through their patch, then there's no resilience because you're overextended. So it's seeing the system, working together as a system, working to look at the whole and not relying on external forces necessarily, deciding what they think is best for them and not for you.
I just want to thank you, Anna, for the clarification, because I have been thinking a lot about, are we even able to make the change ourselves, or are we simply too old and have been living in a world where we have all the goods, no worries, we're very secure, and can we even give up some of those comforts that we live in order to make a greater difference? And I find myself that it's important to ask this question as well, because otherwise we are just hypocrites that want to change the world but not really having an impact. But yeah, so I thank you for the clarification about doing small steps and keeping the local communities that we are a part of in mind when building tourism, and also having to grow, because some places we need to grow in order to have economical sustainability.
Once you start to see that we are utterly interdependent, interconnected as a living system, it becomes easier not to think it's just about me and what I want. And one of the things that when you spend time in indigenous communities, and I make no apology, they understand 7 generations. All their decision making is always about what is the impact going to be on our children. We don't think that. But we also have a major problem of young people getting mentally ill. Right now they are really, really in despair. So whatever decision you make right now, think as what's it? You may not have a child, you may have a niece, or just your friends' children. Think about their future. What is going to be good for them? So again, I look at the hotel community and say you're part of a living system. If you want to be generative, are you asking the question, how can I contribute more to this community? We saw that, as I say, it's the only example I've had since I've come up here, because we had that lovely dinner last night. But again, you're making a contribution to the broader community in addition to running a lovely spa and a lovely restaurant. What hotels could be doing with the young people in that place, or even the older people who have stories to tell. So I know of places where they've invited some of the old-timers in who maybe have got stories of mining in this community before mechanization, or whatever it might be. But there are people with knowledge in your community that are sitting in homes lonely. Could we be finding a way that they could be participating in becoming hosts? I mean, these are just oddball examples. But once you start to make that shift and say, how can we contribute, as opposed to just extract? Because otherwise you're just saying, oh, it's lovely scenery, people want to come and they want to see the Aurora Borealis. You're extracting value from that piece of nature to make money. But how can you say, okay, well, we're lucky we've got the Aurora Borealis, nobody can reproduce that. But how can we then also use our business to be generating value for the people who are around us? I think I've killed it now.